and welcome to Carlow County Council's Decade of Centenaries discussion series, brought to you by Carlow Libraries and Carlow County Museum. During the series, we'd like to present you with discussions and insights into the stories, events, sources and historiography of the turbulent times of over a century ago. And we'd like to provide you with a better understanding of those events. My name is Louise Kennedy, and today I'm joined by Noelle Grothier, archivist with the Military Archives in Richmond Barracks in Dublin, and we're here in Carlow County's gorgeous museum. Noelle, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you, not least because I love chatting to other archivists, but also because the Military Archives has done so much work over the last decade to kind of illuminate the stories from the Decade of Centenaries period and to make those records more accessible to people, so you're very welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Noelle, maybe we'd start, for any viewers that mightn't be as familiar with the Military Archives, with the work of the Military Archives, maybe what happens there and a little bit about what you do, if that's okay.
Okay, so the Military Archives has been in existence prior to the National Archives Act of 1986. So in 1986 an act came in kind of to account for the safekeeping preservation of records of government departments. But the Military Archives was already in existence before that time. So we're actually the only government department that has its own separate kind of standalone archive. We have a reading room that opens to the public 3 days a week for research, and the collections that we hold would cover anything to do with the formation of the Irish Volunteers in 1913 onwards, to anything to do with the Irish Defence Forces, so even up to today, kind of modern overseas records come into us when units come back from abroad. We would have some older material relating to British Army barracks. When the British Army evacuated, they left a lot of kind of really interesting maps and plans for the different barracks around the country. But primarily what you're talking about really is 20th century Irish military history, and obviously a lot of focus then on the War of Independence and the revolutionary period then 100 years ago as well.
Fantastic. I suppose from my point of view as an archivist, the Bureau of Military History is one collection that lots of people have heard of. It got a lot of attention around 1916 commemorations, but there's so much more in the Military Archives as well as the Bureau of Military History. Is there any particular collection that you'd like to highlight? Yeah,
well, the Bureau, I suppose, was the first one that was kind of readily available to the public. So just a bit of background on it. It was established in 1947 by Oscar Traynor, who was the Minister for Defence at the time. And the idea was that they were going to try to capture witness statements and testimony from veterans of the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, who were still living. So over a period of about 10 years, they conducted interviews with 1,773 witnesses, and the material was all put away for several years, and then in 2002 it was released to the public. There was a set of witness statements in the Military Archives reading room and another set down in the National Archives, and since 2012 they've been available online, so people can just look at the website to take a look at the witness statements there. So it's probably best known purely because it's been available the longest. There's some really interesting, I actually had a look just to see kind of, we have collections that cover kind of the whole country, it's kind of national kind of interest, but I had a look coming out just to see what we have kind of relating to Carlow. So in the Bureau we've got, there's a guy called Pádraig Cahan, sometimes referred to as Patrick Kane. He made a statement in December 1956, and at the time that he made his statement, he was the only surviving member of the Carlow Brigade, Carlow Brigade staff of the IRA. So I mean, he talks about growing up in Tinryland and the influence of his teachers and how he came to be involved in with the Irish Volunteers in the War of Independence. And his job, he worked as a post office clerk, so he was kind of ideally positioned for intelligence work. So things like capturing telephone messages, telegrams, intercepting post. So he was able to advise the IRA unit all around Carlow of what was happening kind of from both with the RIC and with the British Army in the area. And he talks about his experiences then during the War of Independence. And one of the interesting things about the Bureau, the dates for it really, the decision in 1947 was that it would relate to the rising of the War of Independence. So the Civil War is still a relatively fresh memory, so there was a decision made that they weren't really going to investigate beyond the truce on the 11th of July 21. But you find an awful lot of witnesses, they're telling essentially their life story. They don't really stop at the truce just because this is the end date. So you get guys like Pádraig Ó Catháin. He remained neutral during the Civil War. He was picked up and interned because the National Army were concerned that he was sympathetic to Republicans. But he says that you know, he remained neutral during the Civil War. He thought it was a tragedy. And there's a quote from the end of his statement where he talks about his neutrality, stating, "I had engaged in no military activities whatsoever from the day I had walked out of Carlow military barracks. I had stood and spoken against civil war and had meant it. Today, 34 years afterwards, I am happy to remember that my attitude was right, for that civil war threw the progress of Ireland back half a century." So you get information on what was happening in an individual's life, but also on a county level in the Bureau with things like that. So it's a really interesting collection. And as I said, it's probably one of the best known, certainly the longest that we've had available in MultiArchives. We have had, there's a more recent collection which has, I won't say superseded, but in scale it is much larger now. So it's the Military Service Pensions Collection. So from 1924 onwards, there was legislation introduced where veterans of the Rising, the War of Independence, could apply for pensions in respect of the service that they had. And it's a much larger scale than the Bureau. So the Bureau looked 30 years later at kind of small enough groups of veterans who were involved. So the pensions legislation kind of applied to anyone who could prove kind of service. So in scope and scale, it is much wider.
Fantastic. I'm sure, do you get more women then documented because of that as well?
You do. There are a lot. It was more difficult for women to prove active service for a pension, but you do get a wider range of people applying for pensions. Also, it starts earlier. So the Bureau was set up in 1947. The first Pensions Act was in 1924. So you're getting information. Basically, you had to explain your service or your entitlement to a pension. In some cases that was recounting your own history. You also had to provide names of commanding officers who could vouch for the fact that you had the service that you said you had. So in some cases you're talking about information being collected 20 years earlier, and again it's across a wider scale because a lot of people could apply. Many people were unsuccessful in their applications, but they still gave the details of their service. The bar for deciding active service was quite high. So there's a definition of active service on our website. It wasn't enough to just be a member of the organisation. You had to prove to the satisfaction of the Pensions Board that the service you had was active and that you were entitled to draw a pension for the rest of your life. So I have some stats and statistics there relating to Carlow from the Military Service Pensions Collection. The important thing to remember about that collection so far is that it is still ongoing. So the first release online was in 2014. There's been, I think, approximately 10 releases since, but there was a decision made at the start of the project that they would put material out there as it was available. If they waited until everything was finished, it still wouldn't be ready, and most of the decade in Centenaries would have passed us by. So it is ongoing. So if someone's looking up a relative and they're pretty sure they got a pension and they can't find them, it likely just means that they haven't reached that file yet. It hasn't been catalogued for release yet. But as of this month, September 2021, there are 130 applications for pensions for people who have a Carlow address in the catalogue. And there's also medal applications for 851 personnel. So there's quite a lot of content on there that relates to the County of Carlow. Pension files can be downloaded from the website. You can sit at home and look at them at your leisure. The medal files, it was a much broader project, and the content of the files will be slightly less because it wasn't as difficult to prove service. So the medal files aren't digitised. If you find the catalogue entry relating to the medal file, you'll need to come into the MultiArchives reading room and we can show you the file there. But it still gives you content and background on why your relative might have been awarded a medal for their service.
Fantastic. And if someone thinks that there's a pension application there that they can't see online yet, is it possible to come to the reading room to look at that, or are they? At
the moment it's not, they haven't been catalogued by an archivist, they haven't been made publicly available. So what you can do is email us, our contact details are all on our website, but if you can contact us by email, we can do a search. We have some old index cards of finding systems, we can do a search, but until the files are processed, they're not available for public research. There's work to be done in cataloguing the file and in getting it digitised and making it available. So it is a long-run project. We don't have an end date in sight yet, but it will be fantastic when it's completely finished. There's a few other things actually. People use the military service pensions collection primarily for if their relative got a pension or a medal, but there's also interesting material in there at a kind of a company and battalion level. You get these IRA nominal rolls, so you can see the names of personnel in various companies and battalions around the country. So there's lists there for the company rolls for Carlow, so you can see, well, I mean, some people might not have applied for a medal or pension. They might have passed away. They might have taken a kind of a staunch Republican view that they didn't want to apply. So you can still find information. You might find a name on a roll suggesting that the person was involved, even if they didn't actually apply for a medal or a pension. One of the other really interesting things in it is there's a brigade activity report. It was done for each brigade area. So in the 1930s, the Pensions Board asked that old IRA committees would compile their account of the actions that happened in their area. And it would be a useful resource when people would come forward trying to claim a pension. The Pensions Board would be able to refer back and see if they mentioned an action that personally they were involved in. The Pensions Board could check the brigade activity report for their area and check and see, did that happen? Do we have a list of the personnel who was involved? What did that action actually entail? So the operations that they carried out are relatively routine. They're pretty standard across the different brigade areas. You'll see they're doing things like raiding for arms. They're burning down disused RIC barracks or barracks that the RIC have withdrawn from. They're felling trees to block roads. They're breaking bridges. There'll be engagements with the RIC, with the army. There was one I found in the Carlow Brigade Activity Report, which I thought was quite interesting and I hadn't really seen in too many others. There was a mill in Carlow and a tie, Shackleton and Sons Mills, and they used to have a contract with the British Army. So they used to send flour by canal along the canal up to barracks in Dublin for flour for the British Army to use for making bread. And in Monasterevin, the Carlow Brigade actually extended north into part of Kildare and east into parts of Wicklow. So Monasterevin, the company Monasterevin would have been part of Carlow Brigade. And there's a report of the company in Monasterevin at some point in the months just before the truce in July 21. One of the actions that they claim to have carried out is to have dumped 40 tonnes of Shackleton and Sons flour into the canal to disrupt the supply of food to the British Army. So I just thought it was slightly unusual in that it wasn't a standard kind of activity really. So I did a bit of digging just to see was there any other reference to 40 tonnes of flour you'd imagine would have turned the canal white.
Absolutely.
So, we had a look at the paper from the time, the Nationalist and Leinster Times. There was a report in November 21 from the Kildare Quarter Sessions where there is a report of loss of flour. So Messrs Shackleton and Sons claimed compensation for the loss of 347 bags of flour. Arthur Percival Coleman, manager of the mill, gave evidence of the value and of the shipping of the flour. There were 347 bags containing £146 each, the total value of which was £580 and 18 shillings. The value of sacks would be 6pence each. The skipper of the boat said all went well until he left Monasterevin and went to Rathangan. They were held up and all the stuff was thrown into the canal. There were between 50 and 60 men in the hold-up, and a decree of £614 was to be levied off the county at large to pay the mill for the loss of their flour. So you see, you get these military actions and engagements, kind of quite dramatic and exciting things happen. You get routine actions, and you get these slightly unusual kind of things that are kind of specific to particular brigade areas as well. So Shackleton Mills.
I'm sure the company would have regarded themselves very successful based on that.
Yeah, I suspect. Yeah, I mean they did well. It took them within 6 months they got compensation for the loss of flour to the British Army. Now I don't know what the British Army did for flour in the meantime in comparison, but it's even just a visual of 40 tonnes of flour ending up in the canal was kind of caught my eye. So that's the brigade activity reports from the military service pensions collection. It's an interesting read for anyone who wants to take a look.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're discussing the military service pensions collection. Noelle, is there anyone specifically from Carlow who comes up there who has an interesting story?
There's a few different people and names in the collection. One of the most prominent ones that might be most recognisable is a guy, Colonel Commandant Tom Keogh. So He's associated with Collins and the squad. People might recognise the name. But actually, he's originally from Hackettstown. Most of his service is in Dublin, but his parents are still living in Hackettstown. And he takes the National Army, the pro-treaty side, during the Civil War. He joins the National Army. He's serving down in Cork in the early days of the Civil War, and he unfortunately gets killed. There's a landmine explosion in Macroom in Cork, and him and 6 other National Army soldiers die in the explosion. So in the military service pensions collection, obviously he's passed away, but his family are entitled to apply for a pension, a gratuity or pension in respect of their loss from the loss of their son. So his mother is a woman called Julia Keogh. She lives in Hackettstown, and she applied for a pension which is paid up to her death in 1932, but there's quite a bit of investigation. Even if you're as well known or as high profile as someone like Tom Keogh, there's a whole process to be gone through to investigate your claim. So in her pension application, there's letters in support of her application from people like Margaret Collins O'Driscoll, who is a TD. She's Michael Collins' eldest sister, and she's writing to the Pensions Board on behalf of Julia Keogh, saying, "I enclose a letter from Mrs. Keogh. She's the mother of that very splendid man, Tom Keogh, after whom Keogh Barracks are named, and who was killed near Macroom in August 1922. I do not want to raise the matter in the Dáil if anything can be done for her through your department." So she's just letting them know that this woman is in poor condition. She needs assistance, and Pensions Board should do something about it. Otherwise, she's going to raise the issue in the Dáil. So just as a side note there, she refers to the barracks, Keogh Barracks, been named after him. So Richmond Barracks in Dublin was the barracks where the 1916 leaders were taken to be court-martialed after the Rising. It's handed over relatively early on. It gets renamed Keogh Barracks in honour of Tom Keogh, who's one of the early high-profile casualties of the Civil War. Now, unfortunately, Keogh Barracks doesn't stay a military barracks for very long, so it gets closed down later the same year, and eventually it gets moved to the Department of Dublin Corporation, and it gets used for building social housing, and it becomes known as Keogh Square instead. But the link to the name Keogh remains there throughout most of the rest of the 20th century. So it's just interesting to see, where he goes from there. So there is a pension paid to Julia Keogh. Before that's done, there's also a report submitted from the Garda station in Hackettstown into her circumstances to try and estimate, was she fully reliant on the son? Did she need support or assistance? So the report from the Garda station in Hackettstown, 31st of March 1924, "I beg to state that said applicant is the deceased Colonel Commandant Thomas Keogh's mother and is in very poor circumstances, being living in a little house in the centre of a bog on about 3 or 4 acres of land, the poor law valuation of same being about 10 shillings. She has no means of support and was totally dependent on her son's help. I have been to this woman's house and have found her to be in very poor circumstances." So what's interesting in some of the pension files is you get an account of a veteran's service during the War of Independence and the Rising, but because there's a pension going to be paid to the person or to their dependent for the rest of their lives, you also get an insight into kind of social history for most of the rest of the century. Pensions are being paid up to the early 2000s. So you get an account of living conditions, the plight that families can be left in if a veteran is killed or disabled, or even the losses that people experience through their service during the War of Independence and the Civil War. Some people had to go on the run, lost their jobs, lost their businesses, and some people lost their lives in various incidents, and their family had to kind of make do without them afterwards. So it's a really interesting collection for the information it gives on the revolutionary period, but also the impact that's felt across Ireland throughout the rest of the 20th century as a result of what's been happening.
For sure. I mean, I'm sure it seems like a very thorough and detailed process to apply for the pension. Probably people weren't that happy about how rigorous it was, but we get the benefit in the records of having all that detail because they were so thorough as well. Exactly, and you see, I mean, even things like in some cases where there's investigations, you see kind of what they had, the size of the house, the land, or the size of the family that they're trying to raise on it. You get a really detailed account, and yeah, certainly some people aren't particularly happy about the
the level of investigation that goes into it. But as part of the process, if you were successful in applying for a pension, it would be paid for the remainder of your life. So it was quite a high bar to have active service proven. That's the medals that I mentioned earlier were slightly. The criteria to get award of a medal was 3 months service in the IRA at a date prior to the truce. So as long as you could prove membership of the IRA for 3 months, you were entitled to a medal. That was a one-off. It wasn't as a rigorous a process because there wasn't a lifetime pension to go with it.
So one of the other collections that you mentioned, Noelle, was the Army census taken in 1922. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is another collection that it's got a really it's really useful from a genealogical point of view. Basically, the Civil War starts kind of mid-1922. Initially, the National Army is comprised of local IRA units who come in and take over the barracks around the country from the British Army. The split happens within the IRA. This is where people and units start either supporting the treaty or opposing the treaty, and then taking kind of the pro or anti-treaty side. So people who supported the treaty went on to form the provisional government of the National Army, and then the Republican side opposed it, and which led to the Civil War. So initially, the aim of the census was to try and give Army headquarters an understanding of exactly how many soldiers they had on their books, and what was the disposition and strength of the National Army. There had been an attempt at central organisation of the Army, but you're dealing with a brand new Army that's just been set up. There's a civil war after starting. You're not 100% sure what's happening. So things happen a lot at a local level. So for example, there's a telegram from the 27th of September 1922 from the officer in charge in Limerick, who basically just sends a telegram to headquarters in Dublin saying that he's after discharging troops under his command, and he lets them know after he's already discharged them. And his frustration is, he says, reservists discharged owing to the fact that government had taken no notice of repeated appeals to remove prisoners, had no room for them in our jail unless we released irregulars. So you have a theory of how things should work from the centre, but in a local situation, you've got an officer in Limerick who's saying, I have enough space for a set number of soldiers or prisoners. I can't fit both. I'm not going to let the prisoners go. I'm going to let the soldiers go. But it means that from a local, from a central point of view, the Army are kind of going, we don't even know how many soldiers we have. So that was the idea behind the census, was to get an idea of how many uniforms we need, how many pay bills are we going to have, how are we going to administer our Army. So on the night of the 12th and the 13th of November, each post around the country was to fill in a census return, and they would record a regimental service number, rank, corps or unit they were serving with, the soldier's surname, Christian name, age, home address, the date they joined the Army, where they joined, whether they were married or single, because you got paid a different rate depending whether you're married or single, your religion, your next of kin, in case they needed to be able to inform your next of kin of casualties, and a remarks column, just if there's anything else. So the census,
a lot of detail.
Yeah, they're a fantastic genealogical resource because the amount of detail that's in them. So you get the soldier's name, you also get their next of kin, you get a rough age, and you get the point where they joined the Army. So it's a great starting point for doing research. We can check and see if there's any more detailed reference to them either. But it also gives a good snapshot of what the Army was like November 12th and 13th of November 1922. So the Civil War is still on. A lot of the fighting has moved kind of slightly outside of Dublin City, but it's still widespread across the country. Like it's the height of the Civil War, and you've got a snapshot of how big your army is and where they're dispersed across the country. So there's a few exceptions. So for example, if someone is on leave, they might not have gotten picked up. If you get someone who joins the Army in December, they're not going to be picked up in the census. I have another kind of interesting telegram from the officer commanding Drumbo up in Donegal on the 1st of December. So it's 3 weeks after the census has been taken, and his instruction is just recruit 300 men, will require both companies within a fortnight. Date will be supplied later. So you still get, there's still a lot of stuff happening at a local level. So you still have a lot of stuff to deal with, but at least you've got some idea of what's happening with the census from early November. So just to look at kind of Carlow specifically, on the night of the census, there were 3 National Army posts in Carlow. There was one in Carlow town that has 258 officers and men. There was a post in Tullow, which had 55 officers and men, and another post in Burris, which had 56 officers and men. So one of the other interesting, I mean, they're fantastic genealogical resource. If you know your relative was in the army, you can take a look. But even from again, from a more academic point of view, it's interesting to see the posts around Carlow. If you look at the home addresses for a lot of the guys in Carlow, they are kind of Carlow men. So during the Civil War, a large part of the population in Carlow remain neutral. They don't particularly take a side, but it would be slightly more in favour of the treaty than Republican forces. So if you look at census returns for somewhere like Kerry or Cork, you're going to see there's an awful lot of soldiers have Dublin addresses because they had to send troops from Dublin down. You'll find troops from different parts of the country because there might have been a strong Republican sentiment there. You mightn't find a huge number of local soldiers in posts like that. But in Carlow, you do find that the vast majority of the addresses are local people. You get Carlow, Kildare, Wexford, Wicklow. So it's interesting just to see, well, okay, we know how many people are there, but actually where are they made up from? So it is, Carlow wasn't, there was a lot of activity going on, but they were, it would have been a slightly quieter county during the Civil War compared to lots of Munster, obviously.
Okay, yeah, it's amazing to have that record in that way.
Yeah, it's a lot of information can be taken from the census,
Sure.
and it can be a great starting point then to see if we can find anything else on a service record or if there's anything about the particular post. Actually, it's interesting. The post in Tullow pops up in another collection later on where there's a query about whether they're going to remove it or not. So it's interesting to be able to follow some.
Okay, so you
some
can cross-reference across the collections.
Yeah, across collections you can see. Actually, there's that reference there to the Tullow post. I have it just here. So basically, there's a collection. It's Department of Defence A files, so the administrative records. A lot of it relates to things like policy or procurement, so buying uniforms or just trying to settle big issues at Department of Defence level. But there's a file in that I found relating to Carlow, where there's a district justice for Carlow and Kilkenny, who he writes a report for the government dated July 23. And he titles it Confidential Report for Use of the Government Relating to the County of Carlow. And it's a solicitor named Terence Doyle who's writing the report. And he's writing in July 23, so the Civil War has ended in May, but he's writing to speak about his frustration about rumours that the military post in Tullow is about to be removed. It had been there in November at the night of the census. I think it's 55 personnel in it. It was relatively strong post there. It was removed in February 23 at a time when they were trying to consolidate their forces elsewhere. And in this report, Terence Doyle says that the military station in Tullow removed in February 23 resulted in an outbreak of looting and destruction in the town, which did much to damage the prestige of the government. So in February 23, they removed the post, but they end up putting it back pretty quickly because they're concerned about the impact of it being gone. By July, the Civil War has ended. Things have changed again slightly. He's urging them to leave the post there, that it's required. But the only follow-up I can see from that is 20th of July, the Office of the Commander-in-Chief in Portobello Barracks states it's quite simple. He just says arrangements are being made to leave the garrison at Tullow. So despite local kind of concerns, the army position by July 23 is that this place is relatively secure and stable. We can't justify keeping a post there any longer. They're needed elsewhere, and it gets withdrawn. So it's just interesting. You can nearly follow through from the time they go there to the census to how they end up leaving Tullow, and the main post then would have been in Carlow town from there.
So I suppose from the perspective of people who lived there at the time, they probably had a more stable time than lots of other parts of the country, based on what you can tell from them not needing.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because if you've got a strong military presence there, it's a deterrent to other activity. For sure. But if there's usually a reason why there's a post put there. So I mean, there was a post put in Burris because there was a lot of traffic coming kind of Wexford. So you might find that the post is there because it's an area that needs it, but then the influence of the post is to quieten an area kind of thing. So it's kind of both. It's kind of it quieter town.
Ways.
Yeah, you quieter town if you have a strong presence, but there was a reason why you needed a strong presence.
Sure.
So that was the Department of Defence collection, which gives a good kind of National Army kind of a good overview of kind of the National Army at the time. But it's interesting that we also have collections that give a good, a snapshot or an insight into the Republican or the anti-treaty side of things as well. Okay. So we've a few. There's some collections. So it's the Civil War operations and intelligence collection. Basically, they're daily accounts from each command area about what the National Army are doing. So what reports of actions in a particular area, and it gives you an idea of their presence, the level of activity that's going on, and the number of raids and stuff that they're carrying out in a particular area. And we've also got a Civil War internment collection, which is the administration of the camps and prisons during the Civil War for prisoners picked up, rounded up by the National Army. So just a note on that, actually, if you've got a relative who's interned in the Civil War, we should have reference to them. We should be able to give you some, even just confirm that they were interned. If someone was interned during the War of Independence, it won't be Military Archives records because it was British administration at the time. So, So if you know that your relative was interned at some point, the best thing you can do is check the dates. Depending on the date, if it's War of Independence, 1920, 1921, you need to check the English National Archives in Keogh, or you would need to check with the local prison to see did they keep any records. If they're interned in 1922 into 1923, it's Civil War, the National Army are running the prisons and camps, so we should be able to give you some information on that period, just not the earlier part. But it's interesting to follow. There's so the National Army reports. There's a sample one here from the 19th of October 1922. It just gives an idea of what's happening in the Carlow and Tullow area. So the report states usual patrols operated and raided houses in the following districts: Hackettstown, Knock, Kilnure, Kilkenno. No arrests were made. Commandant O'Day, while raiding in Nerney, captured 10 shotguns. Roads blocked in Ballin area. 7 irregulars escaped from the military barracks in Carlow on the night of the 17th. Hacksaws were used as the bars on the cell windows were sawed across. So it gives you an account. It's telling you, we have these for each command across the country, but it's telling you kind of the granular level of...
It's very local, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 7 guys with a hacksaw escaped out a window from the local barracks. It's also interesting, we were talking earlier about cross-referencing. You can cross-reference across a few different collections. So there's another interesting report there. There's a guy called Michael Ryan from Carlow. He took the anti-treaty side, and he was arrested. He was arrested originally in July 1922, and he was interned in the Curragh in Newbridge. When he was in Newbridge, he escaped. So the 15th of October, he escapes from Newbridge. We have a prison ledger that has the entry just with escape written in red against his name. Wow. He's on the run, but he gets rearrested in May 1923. So 7 months later, he's picked up again. And we have a National Army operations report referring to his arrest. So Carlow area, 26th of May 1923. A party of troops under 2nd Lieutenant Quigley, operating the Michael district, arrested an irregular named Michael Ryan, a brigade adjutant. In his possession was found 1 revolver, 12 rounds of ammunition, 1 typewriter, and important documents. So the important documents refers to, we have another collection, it's captured documents. So essentially anything that was picked up from people who were arrested, or if they were doing sweeps of prisons, or if they discovered an arms dump that might have documents in it as well. All that material was put together and brought to the intelligence section for the National Army so that they could try to use it, to see what information that could be gathered from the documents that they found. So Michael Ryan gets arrested in Michael with important documents on his person. If we go then to the captured documents collection, it's Michael Ryan's, it's held under Lot 12, and he was unfortunate really because there was a lot of information in what was picked up on him. Okay. So there's a draft scheme of organisation, so you get names of all the different people still active in the IRA in the Carlow area during the Civil War. So instantly the National Army have names and addresses of everyone they need to know in Carlow.
Pretty much everyone they want to pick up, right?
Anyone that they want to keep an eye on. It gives a kind of an overview of the whole Republican operation in Carlow. Now he's arrested the 21st of May, so the Civil War has just ended. So the active fighting has just ended, but there's resistance for a long time around the country. So it's still kind of unfortunate timing. It kind of gives them everything they need to know about the Carlow Brigade. But it's interesting to see the kind of work that Republicans were trying to do as well, because there was a survey of the attitudes of people towards the IRA across the different battalions in the county. So I mean, they had the time or the wherewithal to check and see, well, in what areas are we likely to have support. So the reports are usually shown, they'll give the battalion area, so there's 6 battalions within the Carlow Brigade, so the 1st battalion area is Carlow Town. So they talk about what percentage of the 1st Brigade area are hostile to the Republican anti-treaty IRA, what percentage are neutral, and what percentage are in favour of Republican IRA. So it gives you a good overview of sentiment in Carlow at the time. Their own kind of research into how much support do we have around this area. So it's an interesting set of captured documents. He was unfortunate to be captured with them on his person.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure not everyone they captured would have had such a rich wealth of information just on them at the time.
No, most people are picked up routinely in raids on houses. We're travelling light. He was just unfortunate in I'm not sure of the details of his arrest, but he was unfortunate in the volume of stuff he had on him at the time that he was picked up. So it's kind of just a run through a lot of the collections we have. What we've been talking about mostly so far has been the National Army point of view or perspective, or the Republican, the anti-treaty side of things. But one last collection that I talk about that MultiArchives holds, I think it's interesting from the point of view. It gives a kind of a more detailed account across the country. I mean, you would see from the surveys of attitudes, not everyone was hostile to or in favour of the Republicans. There's big chunks of the county of Carlow are neutral. A lot of people are trying to live their lives while all this stuff is going on around them. So there's an interesting collection that we hold, which is known as the Army Finance Office. So essentially it's kind of the aftermath of conflict. There is another collection in the National Archives that deals specifically with damage to property in the post-truce, so Civil War period. So, for example, compensation files, yeah, essentially. So, if your business or house is destroyed in an action during the Civil War, for various different. There's a lot of damage done in Dublin and Cork and Kerry. So if your premise is destroyed, you can apply for compensation through the National Archives, through that legislation, and those files are held in the National Archives. But the Army Finance Office is essentially the National Army. The Army Finance Office deals with the responsibilities that the National Army has in terms of finance. So just discharging the responsibilities. There's routine things like fuel and light. So Alexander's Electric Works here in Carlow was the precursor to ESB. It was a private supplier. They had about 300 customers, I think. They were responsible for supplying light to Carlow Barracks. So this is 1922. Most of the county isn't really lit up at all. But it's a really interesting file. I mean, you see things like the meter readings from, the Alexanders will come in and take the meter readings to see how much electricity the barracks had used. So you have things like that are really, really routine and run-of-the-mill. But then you also get, there's a lot of soldiers in the National Army who came in for the Civil War. They agreed to serve 6 months, and the understanding was they would have work as long as they were required. So as the Civil War winds down, a lot of them get discharged. The size of the army shrinks. Okay. But there's a lot of guys, again, they were taken on in a hurry. They might not necessarily have ever actually gotten a uniform. Several of them never actually got equipped with uniforms. And they were also entitled to civilian clothes on the discharge from the army. So you find an awful lot of clothing claims. There's one here from... a claim by Michael Kavanagh from Accommodation Road, Carlow, in respect of civilian clothing not given on discharge from national forces. So there's really mundane and routine things, they probably wouldn't survive in a records management scheme today.
For sure,
but given the age of the files, they're all there. It gives you an idea of how frenzied or haphazard things were kind of at the time during the Civil War. You also get things like local residents just essentially looking for their stuff back. There's a file on war equipment. There's a John Malloy from Rathvilly in County Carlow. He puts in a claim to the National Army in respect of, he had a double-barrel shotgun at home. It was taken by the military during the Civil War. So in 1925, he's writing to them to try and claim his shotgun back or to get the value of the shotgun. So
it's very personal. I mean, it really brings you into, like, people, they just live their day-to-day lives and they're trying to get on with it. Like, we might look back at it with a different perspective, but to see someone just like, I need some clothes, like, it's...
Yeah, I think you tend to telescope things sometimes in that you look back and you kind of go, oh, everyone was either in favour of the War of Independence or was opposed to it. It's kind of like this side or that side. But the vast majority across the country were busy living their normal lives, and it would be an inconvenience to them. The bridge near them might get blown up. Their shotguns, if they're not seized in a raid for arms, they might be taken, for example, by the RIC or later by the National Army to ensure that they don't fall into other hands. So in a lot of cases, I think for a lot of the local population, it's an inconvenience around their trying to live their daily lives. Again, there's another one there. It falls under, it was a request put in under requisitions. So there's a landowner near Loughlin Bridge puts in a claim for £10, which is his estimated value of 4 trees requisitioned by the National Army in March 1923. So they were felled and used by the National Army to repair a damaged bridge on the Royal Oak Road. So the bridge has been broken up by the Republican anti-treaty side. National Army want to get past, so they go out and fix the road, or fix the bridge. To fix the bridge, they chop down a farmer's trees. And a year or 6 months later, he's kind of going, look, can I have the value of the trees back, please? That was my wood or whatever. So you get all these kind of things. The Army Finance Office give a real, kind of local insight to people who might not necessarily have had any strong sentiment in relation to the Civil War. There's another one there as well. We were talking about the Army Census. There's 3 posts around Carlow in Tullow, Burris and Carlow Town. But there's a claim for compensation from a woman in Michael who can prove that National Army troops were billeted on her for 5 weeks from 19th of July to 23rd of August 1922. So she has to feed and keep them for the 5 weeks in mid-22. So she puts in a claim in January for compensation. It wouldn't be a trivial undertaking to do that. No, she doesn't say what, she gives the cost, her estimated costs of board and lodging or food and lodging for the troops, but she doesn't say how many troops are there. But she puts in a claim kind of 5 months later, it takes a couple of months, and it gets settled in March 23. But she didn't, there's no indication from the file whether she was, what her own kind of feeling towards the National Army was. Sure. It was a convenient location and troops got billeted on her. So we have, like I said, the snapshot of the census. We know the big posts in Carlow Town, but you also get these glimpses of, well, actually there's people and forces moving around all over the place. You get an indication of, well, obviously there was something going on in Michael, kind of July, August. And this is the retreat kind of from Blessington, Baltinglass. They're in Tullow for about a week, and they know they can't really hold it. And the regular forces, Republican forces, are kind of withdrawing south towards Wexford. So they come through Michael, and they're in Michael around July and August. And there's National Army troops there to meet them, or billeted there at the time. So yeah, you get the kind of a sense of what's happening. The last one from that collection, because it touches back to something we were talking about earlier. So Shackleton Mills, the unfortunate guys who had 40 tons of flour thrown into the canal, they were also supplying in 1922-23. They're supplying materials to Carlow Military Barracks. So cotton and jute bags. Their vehicles are used. They're hired by the National Forces because we've had big kind of trucks and things that way. Okay. So they put in a claim to the National Army, kind of going, look, we have a bill outstanding that hasn't been paid. Can your Army Finance Office settle it? Okay. So these guys again, they're supplying flour to the British Army. British Army's gone. They just start supplying to the National Army.
And it wasn't a supply, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're millers. They just need to sell flour. That's the aim. One of the interesting things from the letter that their invoice claiming compensation for supplies to Carlow Barracks, there's a little red seal on the top of it, and it says National Scheme for Disabled Men. And we were having a look to see what that was. So essentially, September 1919, there was a scheme introduced across the UK and Ireland. The aim was to try and encourage companies to hire injured ex-servicemen after World War I. So World War I ends in 1918. You've thousands of returned soldiers who might be injured or disabled in some way. And the aim to try and get some of them back to work is the companies industries were incentivized to hire a proportion or to save a proportion of their jobs for injured or disabled ex-servicemen. Different industries would recommend a percentage. So some jobs wouldn't be
not as suitable.
Yeah, or some industries could accommodate more higher percentage of disabled soldiers than others. But it's interesting. I was trying to see what was the incentive, like what did the company get, for employing disabled soldiers, and they were allowed to use a seal on their headed paper. So the seal would indicate that they had given an undertaking to employ an improved percentage of disabled ex-servicemen, and in return the company's name would be duly inscribed upon the King's National Roll, and the firm would be entitled to adopt and use the seal of honour. So it was essentially it was a prestige thing. If you agreed to hire a number of disabled ex-servicemen, everyone would know about it. I'd imagine it would also assist in getting contracts with things like the British Army for supplying food. And so it was interesting to see this company. Obviously, they're just working away. They submitted this scheme, or they've
obviously signed up to it. And
they signed up to the scheme to help their business and presumably to help injured soldiers. But obviously, it's the atmosphere at the time. Like September 1919, the aim is get people back working. They do whatever. It just shows you how quickly sentiment can change in a place. I mean, this is a scheme that worked well for them in September 1919. Within 3 years, they're supplying Carlow Military Barracks and the National Army, and they're still in business. They just keep working away selling flour.
They do, yeah.
Interesting.
It is, yeah.
So that's kind of a snapshot, a run through of collections that MultiArchives has that relate kind of to this revolutionary period. Kind of an emphasis on Civil War, and then obviously just looking kind of more closely at Carlow examples in that. But is there anything else that you want to discuss?
It's an amazingly rich set of collections that you have, and it's really interesting the way they interact with each other as well, and that it's possible to do that, because you don't always get that with archival collections. You know, a lot of the time it's that collection is standalone, and that's where it ends. So yeah, it's fascinating.
It can be. Our work primarily is making material available. We don't often get time to sit down and read through stuff, but to catalogue it, you have to go through to see what's there, and it can be a bit like detective work. Sometimes you find a thread and you kind of go, I think I saw some of that somewhere else before, and you can link it back and tie these things together. But they are. I mean, we're a national institution. We have material that relates across the whole country. So it was I quite enjoyed narrowing the focus down, looking at our collections and looking at Carlow and kind of go, how can we tie things in there? It's interesting, interesting work.
You don't often get to localise it that small, I suppose. Yeah.
No, not really. I mean, you know, as an archivist, we don't do research. Our job is not to research the material. Our job is to make sure what should be saved is saved, and to make sure that it's accessible to the public. So it was refreshing to take a bit of time to actually delve into things myself.
Great, I'm glad you enjoyed that. I suppose one thing I'd like to ask you about, if we look forward from decade of centenaries towards how people will be doing historical research with your collections, 50 years from now, one of the projects I think is really interesting is the Oral History Project. Are you okay to say a few things about that?
Yeah, we can talk about that. It's actually it's interesting. Again, everything links into each other. I'm the project manager at the moment for the MultiArchives Oral History Project. It started officially in the format that it's in now in 2015, but actually it has its origins in the Bureau of Military History, which we talked about earlier. So the Bureau ran for 10 years, from the late 40s into the late 50s. The focus was to get witness statements from people that were involved. People also handed in a lot of paperwork that they had at the same time. They're known as the contemporary documents. They're a great collection of personal correspondence, artwork, letters, photographs, basically all the kind of things that people had to hand when they went to do their witness statement. But one of the really interesting things that's in the collection is a set of a dozen voice recordings. So in 1951 and 52, the Bureau kind of said it would be really interesting to capture some of these voices, that you're not just written text, that you can hear what the people sound like. And obviously recording technologies is very different in the 1950s, so they worked closely with the Folklore Commission, which is now out in UCD. Okay. They selected 12 kind of prominent people associated with the Bureau and with the revolutionary period. So you've got people like Maud Gonne McBride. Now they tended to read from scripts, so they're quite short. I think the longest is 8 or 9 minutes, and they tended to have it pre-prepared. But you get to hear what Maud Gonne McBride sounds like. So she has this very kind of educated, cultured accent, and she opens talking about the evictions she saw in her childhood in the 1870s or 1880s in Donegal, and instantly you're kind of linked back a whole century. So there's a dozen of these from the 50s. We have them digitised now. They're actually on our website. People can listen to them there. And then I was saying to you earlier as well, MultiArchives has been around in some form or another for decades. It predates the 1986 National Archives Act. So it had a relatively small staff, but some of the officers that worked there tried to do an ad hoc recording oral history program. So if you had the opportunity, if you had contact with a veteran who you knew had an interesting story, you would try and set aside the time to sit down and record them. So you've got these 1950s interviews from the Bureau. We've got cassettes from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And we were aware that soldiers love to talk. I mean, I go into any tea room in barracks around the country. You're there 2 minutes and they'll all be telling you stories. Some of it I think is probably folklore, some of it is true. So there's myth and legend, there's a whole lot of stuff in it together. But it's a real military thing that like people sit down and they just start chatting. And the background of the oral history project was the aim is to try and capture a lot of this information and kind of this moment in time, what do Irish soldiers do. So in 2015, the project was formally established. Since then, we've collected over 350 interviews. We've a few different interviews around the country. One guy is especially prolific in the Air Corps in Baldonnel. He's done hundreds of interviews. And they cover anything. We've interviewed retired veterans who served in the Congo in the 60s. We got in touch with a guy. His web address was Grandad Online. He'd grown up in a military barracks because his father was in the army, and he served in the emergency. So we interviewed him about serving in the 1940s.
That's amazing.
So we really interesting. There's interesting stories up to present day. 2 weeks ago, I was down in Cork. It was the 75th anniversary of the Naval Service. We were trying to capture some of the stories of recent years in the Naval Service. So this is completely on a tangent relating to Carlow, but there was a major operation in the Mediterranean a few years ago called Operation Pontus. Irish Naval Service vessels went down to assist other navies to rescue migrants from the sea. So these interviews go from things like Maud Gonne McBride talking about evictions in the 19th century to guys telling us about trying to pull pregnant women out of the water 3 or 4 years ago in the Mediterranean. So some of the interviews are available on our website. There's a lot. We're still focused very much on the collection phase, so there's a lot of content that will become available in future years. It's still very much a work in progress. But it's an interesting project and collection which builds on stuff that goes back to the revolutionary period as well. So everything is linked, things don't change, it's just...
That's amazing,
to
have that connection. It's really, really
it's interesting to tie it back.
Definitely it'll be an incredible resource in the future as well.
Hopefully it gives a sense of what does the Irish Army do. I mean, it's a defence force, so gives you an idea of what personnel do. You see them walking across the barracks. Actually, this time last week, could have been in the Mediterranean, or they could have been, it's just to dig a bit under the skin a bit and see what else is there.
Sure, yeah. I suppose we'll wrap up on this one maybe. For people who want to do research in the military archives, obviously the collections are hugely rich. Are there things that people sometimes expect to find in the military archives that actually aren't documented. Does that come up often?
Yeah, sometimes it can be difficult sometimes dealing with expectation. You know, people who are... So, for example, we have service records for soldiers. So anyone who goes into the army, there'll be a record of when they joined, who their next of kin was when they joined, what unit they were in, how long they served, any particular courses they might have undertaken. So, for example, more recently, if they went overseas, their overseas service will be accounted for. So service records can only be made available to either the soldier of concern or to their proven next of kin. So sometimes people come in and go, oh, I think my dad's cousin was in the army, I'd love to have a look. And if you're not the next of kin, there's a lot, legislation has an impact on what you can do. So data protection legislation, if I'm a soldier, I have a service record and I'm still living, that's my personal data. I can't just give it out for research to somebody else. If I pass away, data protection doesn't apply to me anymore. But because of the nature of the work soldiers do, next of kin are listed on it. So if I have kids or anything listed on the file, my file says closed, the data protection still applies to the personnel, the family listed in. So sometimes people will come in and they think it's just a matter of saying, I want to see this. And you're trying to explain to them, you have no entitlement to see that. Yeah. But not often. Most people are, you know, it's just a matter of demonstrating that you are related. So my dad's was in the army, he's now passed away. That's fine. If you show us the link to the soldier, we can show you the file, there's no problem. Sometimes we send them out to people, or we show them to people, and they're kind of going, oh, I thought there'd be more, there might be photographs, or that there might be, accounts of what he did. A service record is an admin file. It tells you, sometimes people kind of go, where was he? I was like, well, like it says he's in, I don't know, an infantry battalion. If we know what barracks that infantry battalion was at a particular time, we'll be able to tell you based on our knowledge. But it doesn't say in Carlow from 20 to 24, and then move to Dublin from 24 to 30. It's how your record's administered, so it's just the unit that you served in. So it's not, occasionally there can be issues with managing expectation, but for the most part, people are just excited to come in and see, like, what. If you think about it, I mean, if your dad is a baker, or your granddad's a baker 100 years ago, you're probably not going to expect that you're going to be able to find a service record for him, or details about his work. You might find a listing of a business, and you kind of go, oh, that's where he worked. But the army is slightly unusual in the level of information that is required on an individual. So, I mean, it can be interesting to see what survives from relating to a career. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for it. That was absolutely fascinating conversation. It was really interesting to learn about different collections and how Decade of Centenaries and the later period are documented in the archives. Really appreciate your time.